The first hard frost came a week earlier than anyone expected, and the sound of it woke her before dawn. It was not a loud sound, not like thunder or a branch breaking, but a thin cracking noise under the floorboards, as if the ground itself had stiffened in its sleep. She lay still beneath her quilt and listened. The cabin walls held their breath. The wind had not yet risen. Only the slow ticking of cooling ashes in the stove and that faint tightening of earth under timber. She knew what it meant. Winter had chosen its day. Out on the ridge, smoke would soon lift from the neighbors' chimneys, and men would stamp their boots and curse the cold while splitting wood they should have cut weeks before. Wagons would creak toward town for flour and salt pork. Children would press noses to glass. And before long, someone would complain that the firewood had gone damp again, that the stacks leaned under snow, that the long months were harder than last year. But not here. She pushed herself upright, wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, and stepped barefoot onto the floor. The boards were cool but dry, always dry. She walked to the iron stove, stirred last night's coals, and added 2 pieces of split oak. The flame caught at once, quick and clean, not a hiss, not a puff of steam. She watched it for a moment, a quiet pride warming her more than the fire. The secret held. By sunrise the sky turned pale and the valley below filled with blue morning haze. She opened the door and stood in the doorway, breathing the cold air. The woodpile outside looked ordinary enough, stacked near the fence where anyone passing could see it. Snow would soon cover it like every other winter. No one would look twice. They never did. The road down the hill curved past her cabin toward the creek crossing, and she saw old wagons already moving, slow shapes through mist. One stopped for a moment as a man leaned down to tighten a strap, then rolled on. No one came up her lane. No one ever did unless they meant to. She shut the door and slid the bolt into place. Inside, the cabin held its steady warmth. One room, low ceiling, table by the window, rocking chair near the stove, a narrow bed against the far wall. Everything plain. Everything honest. The sort of place folks forgot as soon as they left it. That was how she liked it. She moved the braided rug near the center of the floor just a little with her foot, enough to expose the faint line between boards. A careful eye might notice it. Most never did. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the small gap beside the iron ring set flat into the plank. For a moment she listened again, though she did not know what she expected to hear, only habit. Then she lifted. The trapdoor rose heavy but smooth, hinges silent from years of oiling. Warm air met cool air in a slow exchange. Below lay the stacked firewood, cut to equal length, bark dry and clean, arranged tight against timber supports. Not a trace of frost. Not a hint of rot. The scent of oak and hickory drifted upward like summer preserved. All winter her firewood stayed dry. She climbed down the short ladder and stepped onto packed earth. The small chamber stretched wider than the cabin floor above. Dug deep into the slope years ago, braced with beams she had hauled one by one. The dirt walls were firm, lined with stone near the back where groundwater once seeped until she solved that too. A vent pipe angled through the hill to draw away damp air. Everything measured. Everything earned. She carried up 3 logs, closed the door carefully, and set the rug back as it had been. By mid-morning the sun climbed and the wind came with it. Snow clouds followed behind. She worked through her chores with steady hands, fed the hens, patched a tear in a sleeve ground corn. From the valley rose the sound of an axe striking wet wood, a dull thud instead of a clean crack. She paused at the window and allowed herself the smallest smile. It would be a hard season for many. Near noon a knock struck the door, sudden and heavy enough to rattle the latch. She froze, flour still dusting her palms. No one knocked here without reason. The knock came again. She wiped her hands and opened the door only a hand's width. A man stood there, hat rim white with frost, beard stiff from travel. Not a stranger exactly, but not one she welcomed either. He kept to the lower farms, traded tools, asked questions more than he should. Cold came fast, he said, peering past her shoulder. It does that. The road's turning to ice already. Thought I might warm a moment. She hesitated only long enough to remain polite, then opened the door wider. He stamped his boots and stepped in, eyes roaming the room. They always did. People believed small homes held small lives, but curiosity was a restless thing. He held his hands toward the stove. Good fire. Dry wood too, lucky. She said nothing. After a pause, he glanced at the wood box beside the stove. You cut early this year? Early enough. He bent slightly, picked up a log, turned it in his fingers. The grain showed tight and pale, the bark crisp, not the darkened look of outdoor stacks after a storm. His brow creased. Strange, he said softly. The wind outside rose and pushed a shiver through the walls. Snow began tapping the window. She felt the air shift in the room, something uneasy, something prying. You travel far? She asked, meaning to move him toward leaving. Far enough? He set the log down but did not step away. His gaze drifted across the floor, across the rug. You keep a neat place? I keep busy. His boot nudged the edge of the braid by accident or design. The rug shifted barely an inch. Her heart tightened, though her face did not change. He looked down. Silence stretched, filled only by the low burn of the stove. A body alone out here must prepare well, he said. Storms trap folks for weeks, some years. They do, and damp wood makes a poor companion. Yes. He studied her a moment longer than courtesy allowed, then laughed lightly as if nothing mattered at all. Well, I best head on before the road seals. Appreciate the warmth. She nodded and held the door while he stepped out into thickening snow. He paused at the threshold and glanced back once more, eyes resting on the floor, then tipped his hat and walked down the lane. She barred the door the moment he vanished into white. The cabin seemed smaller after he left. She waited, counting breaths, listening for returning footsteps that never came. Still, unease lingered like a draft through a crack unseen. At last, she moved the rug aside and opened the trapdoor again, climbing down into the earth. The chamber felt steady, safe, the way a buried thing does. She touched the stacked wood, each piece proof of foresight, of nights spent digging by lantern when no neighbor watched. She remembered the first winter after she built the cabin, when rain soaked every cord she stacked outside. Smoke had filled the room, eyes burned, food tasted of bitterness. She had sworn then never again, so she dug. Day after day, soil hauled in sacks, rocks pried loose, beams dragged from the creek bed. Folks thought she hauled potatoes or stored apples. No one asked long enough to learn truth. And when the first snow fell that year, her fire burned clear while others fought damp smoke. She closed her eyes now, breathing the cool, dry air of the hidden place. Above, a faint sound reached her through the floorboards. Not wind, a step. She held still. Another step, careful, testing weight. The latch moved overhead. She stared up into the dim square of light as the trapdoor began to lift from above. The wood above her shifted with a slow scrape, careful, almost polite. Whoever stood in her cabin was not rushing. That frightened her more than a break-in would have. A thief would kick and splinter, a desperate man would shout. This was patience. She did not move toward the ladder. She stepped back into the darker part of the chamber where the lantern light from above did not reach. The air smelled of dry oak and earth, steady as a cellar that had forgotten the seasons. She placed her hand against the wall beam she had carved smooth years ago and waited. The trapdoor rose another inch. A thin blade of gray winter light cut across the stacked wood. Snowflakes drifted through the opening and melted before touching the ground. No voice followed. Her breath slowed. If it was the traveler returned, he had not called her name or even pretended surprise. He had opened the door first and then the floor. That meant he had already made up his mind about what he would find. She climbed the ladder only halfway, enough to see the underside of the hatch. A boot heel stood near the opening, turned sideways as if the person leaned down to look but kept his weight back. She recognized the scuffed leather. He had not gone far. She stepped down again before her shadow could reach the light. The hatch lifted wider, then stopped. A pause stretched long enough that she could hear the wind pushing snow against the cabin walls. At last his voice came, softer than before. I thought so. He did not sound angry. He sounded satisfied. She said nothing. The man did not climb down. He let the trapdoor rest open and waited, as if expecting her to answer. When she did not, he shifted his stance and the hinge creaked once under his weight. You dug it proper, he said. Air vent too. You planned this from the start." Still, she held her silence. He leaned closer, though she only saw the dark shape of his coat edge. "I ain't here to steal your wood." The words lingered in the small chamber. She believed him, and that troubled her more than if he had lied. "Then close the door," she said at last. For a moment he did not move. Snow tapped the boards overhead. "You could have told folks," he said. "Save trouble every winter. They would not have listened. They would have listened to warm fires." "No," she answered quietly. "They would have listened to envy." Another pause. Then the hatch lowered slowly, not shut but nearly. Only a thin line of light remained. "You've been here longer than most," he said. "Longer than the farms down by the bend. Long enough to know the ground better than the rest of us." She waited, unsure where his thoughts wandered. "My brother's place floods every spring," he continued. "Water comes under the house, ruins the flower. We tried stone, ditching, prayers. Nothing holds." She could hear him crouch above, coat brushing the boards. "A person who can keep wood dry through thaw and snow knows things about land." The request finally showed itself. She stepped toward the ladder but did not climb. "I know my patch of land, not his. You won't even look?" "Looking makes promises." The hatch lifted a little again. A narrow beam of light reached her face and she turned aside. "People say you came out here to be alone," he said. "But no one works this hard just to hide." She rested her hand on the stacked logs beside her. Each one held memory of labor, blister, frostbite, and stubbornness. "Sometimes alone is the only way to keep what you build." He considered that. Above, the stove door opened and closed with a metal click. She pictured him feeding it another log, testing again how dry it burned. The thought unsettled her. Someone tending her fire in her own kitchen. "Snow's getting thick," he said. "Road won't hold long?" "I'll go now." She did not answer. The trapdoor lowered fully this time. The iron ring settled into its place with a dull touch. She listened to his steps cross the floor. The door opened, wind rushed in, then shut again. Silence returned, but it did not feel the same. She waited long after his footsteps faded before climbing out. The room was warmer than before. He had added 2 of her logs, both burning clean. She moved the rug back carefully and stood staring at the fire as if it might explain his visit. He knew now. By afternoon the snowfall thickened into a white curtain. The valley disappeared entirely. No wagon tracks remained, only smooth drifts shaping the land into gentle slopes where fences once marked fields. She carried in water, latched shutters, and checked the roof edge for ice buildup. Work steadied her thoughts. Toward evening she climbed the small rise behind the cabin where the vent pipe emerged among stones. Warm air flowed from it, melting a circle in the snow. She brushed powder away so it would not clog overnight. From there she could see the faint outline of the lower farms, smoke barely visible through the storm. One chimney sent up no smoke at all. She watched longer than she meant to. Dusk arrived early, blue shadows filling the woods. Inside, the fire crackled bright and sure, its heat reaching every corner of the room. She cooked a simple meal and sat near the stove with her mending, though her needle paused often. Night deepened. Wind rattled once, then settled into a steady hush. The sort of quiet that winter brings when the world accepts being buried for a time. She had almost convinced herself the day would end without more trouble when a distant sound rose through the dark. A faint knocking, not at her door. She opened it and listened into the cold. The noise came again, carried faintly across the valley. Not wood chopping, not wagon wheels. A signal, spaced and uncertain. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped onto the porch. Snow reached past her boots already. The knocking stopped, then started again, weaker. Someone was striking metal against metal. She looked toward the farm with the silent chimney. The sound came from there. She stood a long moment, weighing warmth against distance. The storm would hide tracks by morning. No one would know she left. No one would know she stayed either. Behind her, the steady fire burned, fed by wood that would last the winter. She turned back inside and stared at the trapdoor beneath the rug. The secret she guarded had kept her safe for years, kept her independent when others struggled. But safety sometimes built walls thicker than winter itself. The knocking came again, then faded into the wind. She took her coat from its peg and held it in her hands, undecided, while the firelight flickered across the floorboards and the hidden hatch rested silent beneath her feet. She kept the coat in her hands long enough for the fire to settle into a low glow. The knocking did not return, yet its memory stayed sharp, like a sound heard in a dream that refuses to fade after waking. Outside, snow slid softly from the roof edge. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had before. She set the coat back on the peg. Then she took it down again. The valley could swallow a person in a night like this. Roads vanished, fences hid beneath drifts, and familiar paths turned strange. But the silence from that chimney troubled her more than the storm. Folks might quarrel, keep distance, even carry grudges across seasons, yet smoke almost always rose in winter. A cold hearth meant sickness, injury, or worse. She opened the door and stepped into the wind. Snow climbed past her calves with each step down the narrow path. The world held no shape beyond a few yards, only pale darkness and the steady breath of winter. She walked slow, feeling for the ground she knew well in warmer months. The trees stood as faint pillars guiding her downhill. Halfway to the bend she stopped. A lantern glimmered ahead, swinging low and uneven. "Hold there!" a voice called through the blowing snow. The traveler emerged from the white hat pulled tight, scarf crusted with ice. He looked surprised to see her as she was to see him. "You heard it too," he said. She nodded. "The chimney." He turned and looked toward the unseen farms. "I was near the crossing when it started. Figured I ought to check. Thought maybe you'd stay in. Thought the same about you." He gave a thin smile and lifted the lantern higher. "Storm like this makes neighbors out of stubborn folk." They walked together without agreeing to it. The snow swallowed their tracks behind them. Neither spoke much. The only sounds were boots pressing drifts and the wind moving through bare branches. After a time shapes appeared, darker forms within the white. The low farm buildings rose slowly into view, roofs heavy with snow. One barn door stood partly open, rocking gently. The knocking came again, weak and uneven. It came from the well pump beside the house. A small figure stood there, striking the metal handle with a stone. The child's arm moved slow, clumsy from cold. When the lantern light reached them, the child dropped the rock and staggered back. The traveler hurried forward. "Easy now." The door of the house hung ajar, snow piled just inside the threshold. No warmth escaped, inside smelled of damp and still air. She followed him in. A woman lay near the stove, wrapped in blankets that had not held heat for hours. The ashes beneath the iron grate were gray and lifeless. Beside her, an empty wood box. The traveler knelt, touched the woman's shoulder, then looked back. "She's breathing but faint." The child stood in the doorway, silent except for chattering teeth. She removed her shawl and wrapped it around the small shoulders before speaking gently. "When did the fire go out?" The child pointed toward the woodpile outside. A drift had collapsed against it, burying most of the stack under wet snow. The few pieces inside were dark and damp, useless. The traveler swore softly. "I passed here yesterday." Smoke was fine then. She moved to the stove and opened the grate. Cold iron stared back. She could not bring her own dry logs here without explaining how she kept them. Yet, without fire, the house would not last the night. He watched her as if knowing the thoughts crossing her mind. "You've got dry wood," he said quietly. She did not answer. "Whatever you've hidden up that hill," he continued, keeping his voice low for the child's sake, "it could save them." She stood still beside the empty box. Years of guarding her secret pressed against a moment that asked for breaking it. If she carried logs from her hidden cellar, questions would follow. Not just from him, from every family once the storm passed. The child coughed softly. She looked at the traveler. "There's a sled in the barn?" He nodded. "Old one but sound. Then we haul from my place." "Enough for tonight," his brow furrowed. "In this storm?" "They won't last otherwise." He studied her face, perhaps measuring resolve against weather. Then he rose and went for the sled without another word. She knelt beside the woman and rubbed her hands to bring warmth back. The child watched closely, trusting simply because someone had come. They worked slow through the snow, pulling the sled uphill, the lantern swinging and casting long shadows over drifts. The path felt steeper on return, heavier with the weight of decision. By the time her cabin appeared through the storm, Both breathed hard. Inside, heat greeted them at once. The child stared at the stove, then at the rug on the floor, sensing something unusual but not understanding. She moved to the center of the room and stood there a long moment. The traveler waited near the door, saying nothing. At last she bent and pulled the rug aside. The iron ring gleamed in firelight. The child stepped closer, curiosity stronger than fatigue. The traveler did not. She lifted the hatch. Warm air rose, carrying the scent of dry oak. Even after the walk through snow, the difference was clear. She climbed down and handed up logs one by one. The traveler stacked them onto the sled in careful silence. None of them spoke of what lay beneath, yet the knowledge filled the cabin as surely as heat. They returned to the farm and lit the stove again. Flames caught quickly, bright and steady. The woman's breathing eased as warmth returned to the room. The child fell asleep wrapped near the hearth. The traveler stood watching the fire. "You dug a cave under your home," he said quietly. "More than storage." "That's survival. It was meant only for me. Nothing stays only one person's out here," he replied. She knew he was right, yet she felt the weight of years shift uneasily. The storm outside howled harder, shaking the walls as if agreeing. He added another log from her sled. "Others will need this before winter ends." "Others will ask for it," she corrected. "And you'll refuse?" She looked at the steady flame. "I don't know yet." Morning would bring questions, gratitude, and perhaps expectations that could not be gathered back once spoken. The valley depended on its own habits, and she had lived apart from them. Tonight had drawn a line she could not erase. The fire cracked, strong and certain, while wind pressed against the windows and the long winter stretched ahead, waiting to see what she would choose next. Morning did not arrive with sunlight, but with a dim gray glow pressing through the frost on the windows. The storm had settled into a steady fall, thick and quiet, the sort that remakes the valley while folks sleep. The farmyard outside the door looked smaller, fences buried nearly to the top rail, wagon wheels only faint circles beneath drifts. The fire in the stove held strong. She rose from the chair where she had rested only a short while and added another piece of dry oak. The traveler stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching the flames like a man measuring time by them. The child still slept on a blanket near the hearth. The woman breathed easier now, color faint but returned. "You should head back," she said. "Your own place will need tending." He shook his head. "Road's gone. I tried before dawn. Snow's waist deep at the bend. We're all in one place till the sky decides otherwise." She stepped to the window. The path toward her cabin had vanished completely. Only the tops of shrubs marked where the hillside began. Her hidden cellar sat alone up there beneath the drifting white, holding more wood than she had ever needed for herself. For the first time she wondered if it would be enough for more than one home. By mid-morning the woman woke, weak but aware. The child clung to her side while she tried to speak thanks that came out in hoarse whispers. The traveler fetched water, melted snow in a kettle, moved about the small house as if it were partly his duty now. No one said much about the cave beneath her floor, but its presence filled the silence. A neighbor arrived near noon, pushing through snow with a shovel across his shoulder. He stopped short inside the doorway when he saw the fire burning bright. "Thought you folks were done for," he said, stamping ice from his boots. His gaze fell to the stacked dry logs beside the stove. He bent, lifted one, and frowned. "This ain't from any pile around here." The traveler looked at her once, then back to the neighbor. "We managed." The man studied the wood again, then the sled outside half buried under fresh snow. Understanding grew slowly on his face, not yet full, but close enough to make her uneasy. By afternoon another neighbor came, drawn by worry and the thin line of smoke now rising from the chimney. Soon boots crowded the entry, coats hung from pegs, breath steamed in the air until the stove warmed the room. Each person noticed the same thing, the dry firewood, the clean burn. The smell of seasoned oak untouched by damp. Questions began gently. "How'd you keep it dry in weather like this? You hauling from the ridge? Got a shed we never seen?" She answered little, keeping words simple, but eyes turned toward the traveler, and he did not speak for her. He only watched, as if leaving the choice entirely in her hands. Evening settled and still the snow fell. Someone mentioned their own woodpile buried under ice. Another spoke of smoke choking a house all night, another of a stove that would not draw. The valley's winter troubles gathered in one room, circling the steady fire that came from her labor alone. The woman from the bed squeezed her hand weakly. "You saved us." The words traveled through the room. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. She felt the years she had spent apart from these people, choosing distance so she would never depend on them, and they would never depend on her. Yet winter had its own ways of tying lives together. The traveler stepped beside her. "Storm won't break for days. Maybe longer." She knew what he meant without him finishing. If she returned to her cabin and guarded the cellar, her fire would burn warm while others struggled. If she opened it, she might never close it again. Wood cut for one winter could vanish in a week across many hearths. The child watched her with tired eyes. Night deepened. They decided to stay together in the largest house rather than risk walking between homes after dark. She agreed, but slipped outside once more before sleep, pulling her coat tight and looking uphill toward where her cabin stood unseen. The path was gone. Only memory led the way. She imagined the trapdoor beneath the rug, the stacked wood, the dry earth walls holding back frost. She pictured neighbors discovering it, feet crossing her floor, hands lifting logs she had cut alone in summer heat. Wind rose again, carrying loose snow in thin sheets across the yard. She turned back inside, leaving the hill to darkness. Morning came with a harder wind. The chimney smoked well, but the wood beside the stove shrank fast. They rationed, using smaller pieces, letting rooms cool between feedings. By noon, a decision could not wait longer. The traveler gathered the men near the door. "We dig a path to her place, sled the wood down. Share it fair." All eyes moved to her. The room held breath. The idea hung there, simple and dangerous at once. A shared effort could keep everyone safe. Yet once the path opened, the secret would belong to the valley, not to her alone. No winter after this would be the same. She looked at the weak woman, the child, the tired faces ringed around the stove. Then she looked at the window where snow still fell, thick and steady. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we carry only what's needed. No waste, no taking ahead of turn." Heads nodded quickly. "And when fall comes," she continued, "every hand helps dig a proper root cellar for each home. No one waits till next winter to suffer again." Agreement rose, quiet but certain. The traveler met her eyes, something like respect in them. They stepped outside together, shovels cutting into drifts that reached nearly to their waists. Each stroke revealed another beneath it, slow progress toward the hidden cabin. The work warmed them, but the cold pushed back just as hard. Snow filled holes as fast as they cleared them. Hours passed. At last the roof edge appeared, then the door beneath a heavy mound. They cleared it, pushed inside, and felt the stored warmth waiting like a held breath. The rug lay where she had left it, untouched. Everyone stopped when she pulled it back. The iron ring showed in the floor. No one spoke as she lifted the hatch. Warm air rose, carrying the promise of many fires. Faces leaned closer, all plain and quiet. Below, the dry, stacked wood waited in the earth, enough for now, but not forever. The traveler set the sled near the opening. "We start careful," she nodded, though her chest tightened at the sight of hands reaching down for the first shared logs. Outside the wind howled louder, driving snow against the walls while the first pieces were carried out into the white. The valley's hope and her solitude balanced on every step. They worked until their arms trembled. One by one, the dry logs came up from the earth and onto the sled. No one rushed, and no one grabbed more than they could carry. The traveler counted quietly under his breath, keeping loads even between households. Snow stung their faces, and wind pushed hard from the ridge, yet no one complained. The valley had long winters, but it had longer memories, and every person there understood what this meant. When the first sled reached the lower house, a small cheer rose, not loud, not careless, but warm. Smoke thickened from the chimney soon after, clean and steady. Another sled followed, then another. Boots packed the path between cabin and farms into a firm trail, a narrow road carved by need and trust. She stood near the trapdoor as the woodpile slowly shrank. Each piece carried away felt like a thread loosened from a cloth she had woven alone. Yet each time someone passed her, they nodded with quiet gratitude, and something inside her settled rather than tightened. By late afternoon the wind eased. The clouds lifted just enough to show pale sky behind them. They had enough stacked in each house for several days at least, enough for rest and planning. No one suggested taking more. The traveler lowered the hatch and placed the rug back gently. "It holds," he said. "For now," she replied. They returned to the largest house as dusk spread across the valley. Fires burned in every chimney again, thin gray lines rising together. The child laughed when she saw smoke from neighboring roofs, a simple sound that warmed the room more than the stove. Over the next days the storm faded into clear cold. Sunlight flashed on snow like glass. The men took turns hauling measured loads from the hidden cellar, while others cut new wood from the tree line where wind had dropped branches. Women dried kindling near hearths and kept kettles warm for those returning from the ridge. The valley moved as one body, slow but steady. No one entered her cabin without her there. No one asked to take more than agreed. They spoke often about building proper root cellars once the ground softened. Plans formed around the table in the evenings, scratched onto paper, measured by lamplight. The traveler brought tools from his place, offering them without trade. A week later she walked the packed path alone at sunrise. Frost glittered across the fields, and the air smelled sharp and clean. She opened her door and stepped inside the quiet cabin. The stove still held warmth from the night before. She moved the rug and lifted the trapdoor. The chamber below was no longer full, but neither was it empty. Enough wood remained for many cold nights yet. The earth walls stood firm, and the vent breathed gently into the morning air. She climbed down and ran her hand across the stacked logs, remembering the summers spent cutting and hauling in silence. Now the silence felt different. Bootsteps sounded above, careful, respectful. The traveler called softly, "You here?" "Down here," she answered. He did not descend. He waited at the opening. "We finished digging the first cellar by the bend. Stone-lined, just like you said. Holds dry already." She climbed up. "Good?" He looked around the small room, not searching anymore, only seeing. "Folks asked me to tell you they won't forget this winter." She poured water into a kettle. "Winters teach what they must." He hesitated. "You staying up here come spring?" The question carried more than simple curiosity. The valley had grown used to her distance, yet something had shifted. "I built this place for quiet," she said. "But quiet doesn't always mean alone." He nodded once, satisfied with that. As weeks passed, the routine held. Each home gained its own small cellar dug into the slope, braced with timber and stone. She showed them how to vent damp air and slope the floor so meltwater drained away. They brought her meals sometimes, or eggs, or repaired a loose hinge without being asked. The exchange felt natural rather than owed. When thaw finally crept into the ground, muddy rivulets ran between snowbanks and roofs began to drip. One morning she stepped outside and smelled wet earth instead of frost. The last shared load of firewood was carried from her cellar that day, not taken but marked as the season's closing. They gathered that evening near her cabin, a small fire burning outside for the first time in months. Children played along the packed path that had become a proper lane. The traveler leaned on the fence and watched the smoke rise straight into calm air. "You kept us warm," he said. "We kept each other warm," she answered. He smiled. "Next winter won't scare folks the same." She looked toward the valley where new cellars dotted the slopes, each hidden but known, each built with lessons learned from one stubborn decision years ago. "No," she said softly. "It won't." Night settled gently. She returned inside and moved the rug once more, opening the trapdoor out of habit. The chamber lay nearly empty now, only a small stack remaining for cool spring evenings. The space echoed faintly, no longer a secret hoard but a reminder of what foresight and hard work could become when shared at the right time. She closed it and stood by the window. Lights glowed from the farms below, steady and warm. For the first winter since she came to the ridge, she did not feel apart from them. The valley would face many more storms. Wood would still need cutting, roofs mending, paths clearing. Yet now each home held dry storage beneath it. Each hearth had a plan against damp and cold. The hidden cave beneath her home had begun as protection, but it ended as knowledge carried across every doorstep. She banked the stove for the night and lay down as a mild spring wind brushed the cabin walls. Outside, the last patches of snow melted quietly, and somewhere down the slope a door opened and laughter drifted upward. Her fire would burn again next winter, and so would all the others.